Welcome to the Wealth Wisdom, where knowledge becomes power and power builds your future.
You've probably heard the phrase national debt so many times that it barely registers anymore. Every country owes money, every government borrows money, and every election season we hear the same tired promise: we're going to fix the debt. But what if the debt isn't actually a problem anyone intends to solve? What if the debt is the whole point? What if the most powerful nations on Earth, from the richest superpowers to the struggling developing states, are being quietly manipulated through a strategy that requires no armies, no invasions, no weapons, just signatures on documents most citizens will never see? What if this invisible strategy has already shaped wars, toppled governments, rewritten economies, and pushed entire continents in directions their people never asked for? It sounds dramatic, almost fictional, but as you're about to see, this isn't conspiracy, it's a pattern. A documented historical pattern stretching across more than a century. A story of institutions that aren't elected yet influence the fate of millions. A story of loans that were never meant to be repaid in full. A story of formulas created behind closed doors, shaping the future of nations. A story of how debt transformed from a financial tool into a method of control. And the most disturbing part? You've lived your entire life inside this system without ever being told how it really works. To understand how it all began, we need to go way back to a time when the global economy wasn't even a concept yet. When countries didn't owe trillions. When empires still ruled through force, not spreadsheets. When the world map was colored by colonial powers that took land openly, proudly, and violently. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Europe controlled enormous portions of the world. Armies marched. Flags were planted. Colonies fed wealth back to their empires. But maintaining control through force is expensive. Troops, ships, infrastructure, administration. It all drains money. Eventually, a new realization formed. Military rule is loud, costly, and risky. Financial rule is quiet, cheap, and incredibly effective. What if, instead of ruling through conquest, you could rule through credit? What if countries willingly surrendered long-term stability, not because they were invaded, but because they signed helpful agreements that tied their futures to foreign lenders? This idea didn't stay theoretical. It became the foundation of a new power structure. After World War I, Europe was in ruins. Economies collapsed, currencies failed, governments struggled to breathe. Into this chaos stepped international lenders with relief loans, lifelines, wrapped in financial conditions. These loans came with strings attached. Countries had to follow strict economic rules, restructure budgets, open markets, and prioritize repaying creditors over rebuilding their own societies. They signed because they were desperate and walked straight into long-term dependence. Then came World War II, another catastrophic collapse, another opportunity for a new global system to be built from scratch. In 1944, world leaders gathered at Bretton Woods. Publicly, the goal was stability. Privately, new machinery of global financial power was being assembled. Two institutions were born: the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. Their missions sounded noble: help countries develop, stabilize currencies, prevent crisis, and in desperate nations, these institutions looked like salvation. Loans for infrastructure, loans to balance budgets, loans to modernize and grow. But buried in the agreements were conditions so strict that countries effectively lost control over their own economic policies. They were told what to privatize, what to cut, what to tax, how to trade, how to run their budgets. These weren't suggestions. They were requirements. It was the official birth of a new strategy. Use debt, not armies, to shape the path of entire nations. Countries lined up for loans in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. They dreamed of development, highways, dams, energy grids, modern cities. But something unusual happened. Instead of growing stronger, many nations grew weaker. Debt exploded, budgets collapsed, economies destabilized. Governments suddenly needed more loans just to pay the interest on old loans. It was a trap, and once a nation stepped inside, escaping was nearly impossible. Latin America in the 1970s and 80s is a perfect example. Nations were encouraged sometimes, aggressively pushed to borrow massive sums. Banks sold loans like candy, promising prosperity. But when global interest rates skyrocketed in the early 80s, the debt became unpayable. Entire countries defaulted, economies shrank, poverty surged. And who stepped back in offering help? The same institutions that encouraged the debt in the first place. But now the conditions were even harsher. Cut social programs, privatize everything, deregulate, open markets to foreign corporations, remove protections for your own industries. This wasn't development. It was restructuring by force. Through contracts instead of weapons. The pattern repeated across dozens of countries. Some leaders protested. Some tried to escape. Some refused to sign. But resistance almost always failed. The pressure was too great. The global system too interconnected. By the 1990s, debt wasn't just an economic issue, it was geopolitical leverage. Powerful nations began using loans to buy political loyalty, reward allies, or punish defiance. Debt forgiveness became a diplomatic tool. Economic pressure replaced military force. Then came the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Southeast Asian economies were booming until foreign investors suddenly pulled their money out, triggering currency collapses almost overnight. Panic spread. Businesses died. Millions lost jobs. Countries begged for rescue. And once again, international institutions arrived with policies written before the ink on the crisis had even dried. Privatizations, deregulation, market openings, fire sales of national assets to foreign buyers. Some argue these steps stabilized the region. Others say they were used as a weapon to push open markets that were becoming too confident, too independent. Either way, the effect was the same. Nations reshaped by debt, not democracy. Then 2008 hit, the global financial crash, and for the first time in modern history, some of the wealthiest nations became the biggest debtors. The United States borrowed trillions. Europe borrowed trillions. Global debt soared. Suddenly, even the richest countries were trapped in the same cycle they had warned others about. And the citizens who never benefited from the risky behavior of banks were the ones paying the price. Austerity, inflation, cuts to services, wages stagnating while costs rise. Debt had become universal. Rich nations, poor nations, everyone now lived inside the same system. In the 2010s, a new shift began. Nations started creating their own global lending networks, using massive infrastructure loans to gain influence abroad. Roads, ports, energy grids, strategic assets connected to long-term repayment terms. Some countries built incredible projects, others slid deeper into dependence. But the underlying pattern stayed the same. Credit creates leverage. Leverage creates influence. Influence shapes political decisions. And now, in the modern world, we've reached a point where almost every country on Earth is drowning in debt. Global debt is now over $300 trillion, a number no nation can ever realistically repay. Over 60% of countries are in debt distress. Most nations spend more on interest payments than on education or health care. Almost every major currency is losing value, and inflation quietly erodes the wealth of everyday people. But here's the twist. While nations drown in debt, the institutions that lend the money grow stronger. Their influence deepens. Their conditions tighten. Their reach expands. This isn't a glitch. This is how the system was designed. Debt wasn't created to be eliminated. It was created to be managed, maintained, extended, used. Debt gives power, and those who control debt control nations. But the story doesn't end with governments, because the weight of debt eventually falls on ordinary people. Your purchasing power drops. Your salary can't keep up with prices. Your savings lose value. Your housing costs explode. Your chances to get ahead shrink. Not because you made bad decisions, but because you live inside a system where money itself is created through borrowing and controlled by institutions far from your daily life. Debt is not just a national issue. It shapes your personal financial reality. And that brings us to the 3 truths you need to know. Truth number 1. National debt isn't always about development. More often, it's about influence. Nations don't just accept loans, they accept conditions. And those conditions shape policy, priorities, and freedom. Truth number 2. The system will never fix itself because it wasn't built to be fixed. It was built to expand. If countries stopped borrowing, the global economy would collapse. So the cycle continues, decade after decade. Truth number 3. Your only real defense is knowledge. Nations may be trapped. Institutions may remain powerful. But individuals who understand how money works can make different decisions, protect their savings, invest wisely, and avoid falling into the same traps on a personal level. The global financial system is a carefully designed machine. It doesn't need war. It doesn't need threats. It only needs one thing: compliance, a signature, a promise, a cycle that repeats. So the real question isn't whether debt manipulates nations, it does. The real question is whether humanity will keep sinking deeper into this system, or whether people will finally start asking the questions no one in power wants to answer. If this opened your eyes, share it with someone who still believes national debt is just a number that governments will fix someday. And if you want more deep dives into money, power, and the hidden architecture running the world, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the more you understand the system, the less power the system has over you.